guys, BG here on a Friday evening. Hope everyone's doing well. Please take the time to follow me on Twitter at Boxing Gossip. Had several requests to do a standalone video to discuss Dillian Whyte versus Mariusz Wach, and I'm more than happy to oblige. I think it's an interesting fight. Let me start by saying when the fight was announced, it was actually a fight that I didn't necessarily expect. Mariusz Wach, for me, he's a decent fighter. He's probably on the periphery of the sort of top 25, top 30, coming off that win against Tepa that he had recently. However, it's sort of hard to quantify that form really in Mariusz Wach's favour because, realistically, Tepa was half the fighter in that fight that he was in previous matchups where, he was seemingly benefiting from the influence of performance-enhancing drugs. But Mariusz Wach, I guess, is relatively highly rated. Boxrec have him rated slightly higher than I do. They have him at number 16 in the world. And he comes to the ring with a record of 33 wins and 2 losses. He's a very, very big guy. He's listed as 6'7.5". He looked particularly big in some recent photos that were released of him when he was sparring with Anthony Joshua, although admittedly in those photos he was wearing boots whereas Joshua was barefoot. But he's a very, very big guy. He's known as insanely durable. He took an absolute pasting over 12 rounds against Vladimir Klitschko and stayed up. He took an absolute pasting over 12 rounds against Alexander Povetkin and stayed up, but was stopped due to a cut, if I recall correctly, in the 12th round. But yeah, he's a fighter on the fringes of the world scene, I guess you could say. And at 37 years old, having had those 2 losses when he stepped up to the elite class, I guess you could kind of make a case that this is really last chance saloon for Mariusz Wach. Yeah, a loss here to Dillian Whyte. It would be hard for him really to have too many ambitions to go back to world title fights and to fight in the top in the sport again following on from that. If you actually look at his record, Wach's got some decent wins. There's the Tepa win. There's other wins against, the more sort of gatekeepery type names, the Nascimentos, Konstantin Aretz, Benga Alukan, Chavis Walker, Ty Fields, Gavern, those sort of guys. Earlier on in his career, he stopped Christian Hamer when Christian Hamer, if I believe, was an 8-fight novice. But funnily enough, that Christian Hamer win may actually have been the strongest piece of form on his resume in the purest sense, because Hamer's gone on to string together 1 or 2 decent wins since that loss. But yeah, Mariusz Wach, I guess, good fighter, known largely for his durability. In that Povetkin fight, in the Klitschko fight, he wasn't really winning rounds off those guys, but he showed immense durability and immense chin and punch resistance to stay in those fights for as long as he did, and to not fall under the power of those two who are some of the biggest hitters in boxing. From a stylistic perspective, how would I describe Mariusz Wach? I'd describe him as a fairly basic ABC outside boxer. He's quite capable when he gets his jab established and he's able to dictate range. He's not terrible. He's a bit better than like a Dimitrenko or a Ustinov. Those kind of tall, rangy guys who like to jab. He's a bit plodding. He is a bit plodding. He's a bit slow. In fact, let's have it right, he's very, very slow. And I think, really, he's limited defensively as well. I know he's known for having a great chin, but he doesn't half rely on that. He's no defensive slickster. Against a guy like Mariusz Wach, Dillian Whyte is going to have to really look to close the distance for me, because Whyte is going to be the smaller man in there. I would assume that Wach is going to have a substantial advantage, certainly in terms of height, although I know from other fights I've seen Dillian Whyte in that he has deceptively long arms for his frame. But recently we've seen Dillian Whyte try and box more behind a jab and try and dictate fights with range, and I kind of feel that if he does that here, it becomes a more even fight. I actually think Wach is semi-capable behind a jab, and would potentially have the ability to nick rounds off Dillian Whyte if the fight was at long range. Dillian Whyte has improved from a boxing perspective. He's not as wide and as sloppy as he used to be, but he's no technician Whyte. His jab is sometimes a bit you know, poorly constructed. He doesn't sort of stick it straight out. Sometimes you almost see him flicking it out, and you know, that's exaggerated to prove a point on this video. But yeah, he's someone who could be beaten by an effective long-range jabber. Dillian Whyte's got a lot of advantages in this fight. He's probably the bigger puncher, although I don't necessarily believe Dillian Whyte's got the puncher to take out a guy like Mariusz Wach, because you know, Wach is a huge chin, as we know. Whyte's got an advantage in terms of age, in terms of momentum, and in terms of miles on the clock. Wach's been the kind of guy who's been on the scene for a long time. He made his professional debut some 12 years ago, and he's been involved in some hard fights and taken one or two hard beatings en route to where he is today. So Whyte's got an edge in terms of freshness, he's got an edge in terms of age, an edge in terms of power in my book, and he's going to have home advantage on an Eddie Hearn show at the O2 Arena where he's in the headline fight. I do make Dillian Whyte a favourite in this fight. I think Wach is an interesting opponent because he's probably towards the top of the opponents that you would comfortably pick Dillian Whyte to beat. Yeah, for me, if you stood up one class above a Mariusz Wach, you know, the guys who are a bit smoother, a bit slicker, a bit quicker, guys like Bryant Jennings, you know, guys of that sort of nature, I think they're guys you could actually pick to beat Dillian Whyte and to upset him. But I think against a guy like Mariusz Wach, who's a bit slow, a bit stiff, a bit robotic, I think Dillian Whyte probably does have enough to beat guys of that nature. But I must admit, when it was announced, I thought it was a strange fight. And I thought it was a strange fight for two reasons. Firstly, this is Dillian Whyte headlining the O2 Arena. Now, Dillian Whyte, for me, has never been someone who's a big ticket seller. Granted, he's been in big fights with the likes of Anthony Joshua, but for me, he's very much done that as the opponent. And whether Dillian Whyte has a fan base of hardcore Dillian Whyte fans who are going to, you know, tune in to watch Dillian Whyte fight, or whether they're going to, you know, buy tickets in bulk to see Dillian Whyte fight, that's something that I'm unclear on. You know, let's not forget that Dillian Whyte versus Ian Lewison, the Battle of South London, was held up in Scotland, if I recall correctly. And that kind of shows the point I mean. You know, Eddie Hearn wouldn't have held that fight in Scotland if Dillian Whyte was a monstrous ticket seller back home in London where he's based. So I think that's going to be an interesting test. I expected we'd be more likely to see Dillian Whyte against a big name or a domestic name because, you know, it would need that kind of level of opponent in order to sell the tickets, because at this moment there doesn't appear to be an all-star undercard by any stretch underneath this main event. So I thought that was the first reason that I was surprised here. Mariusz Wach certainly isn't a draw from a commercial sense. I think the other thing is, because Mariusz Wach is kind of unknown, obviously he's known to us hardcore boxing fans who follow the heavyweight division, but the average Sky Sports casual fan punter may not have heard of him. If he gives Dillian Whyte trouble in this fight, and I think there's potential that he could do that, you know, I'm picking Whyte to win, but I think with Wach's style, he really will look to keep reins, and I think Dillian Whyte, in more recent fights, has started a bit slower, has had a look, and don't be surprised if Mariusz Wach is able to pick up early rounds if Dillian Whyte does that here, because I think Whyte is potentially vulnerable to someone, you know, with a technical construct and someone who can establish a jab against him. I think Dillian Whyte is still slightly raw and slightly green from a sort of outside boxing perspective. You know, there's some defensive frailty there. So if Wach is able to establish the jab earlier on, he could make Dillian Whyte look quite bad, and he could take rounds of him. Now, I think Dillian Whyte's got more in the locker. I think he's going to want it more. I think he's fresher, and I think when he comes in and mixes it up, he's a harder puncher, and you know, he's probably a more eye-catching operator than Mariusz Wach. So I do expect him to win the fight, but I think there's potential that Mariusz Wach, who isn't really in most people's heavyweight top 15 or top 20, could have Whyte looking bad for spells of this fight, which, you know, may not be a good look for a guy like Dillian Whyte. I think another thing you've got to factor in is Mariusz Wach's been sparring Joshua extensively. Now, I always believed that someone like Eddie Hearn, whose whole business and financial situation seems to be geared around Anthony Joshua, will probably have some eyes in camp when there's sparring like that going on. In fact, the Dave Allen fight, which we'll come to in a separate video, the opponent in that one, Lenroy Thomas, is another one that's been sparring with Anthony Joshua. So, you know, potentially another fighter that Hearn or one of his team will have been able to have eyes on through sparring that's taken place with AJ. But maybe they've had feedback from, you know, members of the team that Mariusz Wach is very beatable at this stage, and, you know, maybe they've had feedback that the way that he's being handled in sparring by Anthony Joshua should mean that, I don't know, a top 20 fighter like Dillian Whyte should be able to carve him open. I really don't know. But for me, Mariusz Wach, whilst he's a beatable fight for Dillian Whyte, is possibly not the one I'd have picked, because the fact he's so durable means that this could well go 12 rounds. And with Dillian Whyte being sometimes a bit sloppy, sometimes not in the best shape, a guy who can fight behind a jab for 12 rounds, as Mariusz Wach has shown in his career today, could actually be a guy who makes Dillian Whyte look you know, pretty sloppy for spells of this fight. Because if you look at Dillian Whyte's big wins, you know, the Derek Chisora fight, he probably lost 5 or 6 rounds of that fight as a minimum, and you could say Derek was the one who came on stronger. The Ian Lewison fight, he had some problems in that fight when Lewison was able to establish his jab, but Lewison's fitness let him down. Even the Dave Allen fight, there were some problems there, but Dave Allen wasn't really active enough and didn't turn up fit enough because he'd been, you know, inactive. But those things won't happen in the Mariusz Wach fight, and Mariusz Wach is bigger and rangier. So, you know, all in all, I do see this as a potentially testing fight for Dillian Whyte. I think it's a fight where, you know, Dillian may not look too good. I think Wach might raise 1 or 2 questions about the fullness of his arsenal. But it's a fight I expect Dillian Whyte to come through having potentially looked a bit rough in a few places and potentially have, you know, had to go the distance with Mariusz Wach. You know, a lot of talk about where Dillian Whyte will go from this fight. He seems to be talking about a WBC title fight with Deontay Wilder. I'm not 100% sure how realistic that is. Last I heard, Deontay Wilder had a mandatory obligation in Bermain Stavern. I've also heard a number of ramblings from the Sauerland brothers that Chisora Helenius is some sort of eliminator, or maybe even a final eliminator for the WBC title, which would seem a bit bizarre given that Chisora just lost to Dillian Whyte himself. But, you know, maybe if that's the case, there'll be a bit of a queue to fight Deontay Wilder. So I don't know, you know, how realistic that fight is next up for Dillian Whyte. But it's, I guess you could say that Dillian Whyte is still a prospect on his way up in the sport, and, you know, Mariusz Wach is a different test. He's a durable test. He's going to give rounds. He's going to pose the problem of a, you know, sort of orthodox Eastern European ABC boxer who likes to keep reins and likes to jab, and it'll be interesting to see how Dillian Whyte deals with the test, but I do expect him to win. Let me know your thoughts on this video, people. What do you make of the fight? Who do you expect to win? Were you surprised to hear what was announced? And give me your take on ticket sales. I understand that, you know, they may only open up the lower part of the arena, which is 9,000 seats for this event. But, you know, is Dillian Whyte enough of a draw to be headlining events at this stage? And will he sell out the arena? Drop your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, please take the time to subscribe. Many thanks indeed for watching.